Okay, let's dive into this explainer. Imagine, just for a second, that you want to buy an airport. You find some massive plot of land, pave a runway, let the planes land, and just collect the fees, right? I mean, it sounds like the closest thing the modern world has to a literal toll booth. Think about it. One road in, one road out, and absolutely everyone who uses it has to pay you. There is zero competition. Nobody is going to build a second airport right next door to yours. You are, by definition, the only option in town. So the dream is to just sit back, watch those planes arrive, and let the money roll in. And honestly, that dream isn't entirely wrong. But today, we're going to explore what actually happens in that massive gap between the dream and the reality.
To really wrap our heads around the massive stakes involved here, we've got to look at this number. Back in 2022, a consortium of Australian superannuation funds swooped in and acquired full control of Sydney Airport for a staggering 32 billion Australian dollars. 32 billion. That is the largest infrastructure takeover in Australian history for a single airport. And here's the kicker. The buyers actually considered it a reasonable price. Why? Because they weren't paying for what the airport earned in 2022, especially right in the middle of a pandemic hangover. No, they were paying for a 99-year monopoly concession. They essentially bought a permanent, unbreakable monopoly in a major global city for as long as human beings continue to fly.
But you might be wondering, who actually sells these massive assets? Well, starting back in the 1980s, governments around the world kind of woke up. They realized they were sitting on enormously valuable monopolies, which sparked a massive privatization wave across more than 90 countries. Look at this stark contrast. Over in Europe, 76% of all passenger traffic moves through privately owned airports. In Latin America, it's 78%. But the United States is a huge, glaring exception, because U.S. airports are typically funded through tax-exempt bonds, which private buyers can't easily get their hands on. Major hubs like JFK, LAX, and Atlanta remain publicly owned by cities and states. In fact, San Juan, Puerto Rico is pretty much the only major exception. Section 1. The billion-dollar barrier. Let's take a look at the brutal reality of what it actually takes to get into this game. Let's move to and see how this builds out if you decide you can't easily buy an existing airport and want to build one from scratch. First off, you need land. Not just a big lot, but between 50 and 140 square kilometers of perfectly flat, legally cleared land. Next up, runways. And these aren't just big roads. They are massive engineered structures designed to take the impact of 400-ton aircraft slamming into them at high speeds every single day for a century. A single new runway often costs over $1 billion. Just to put that into perspective, Gatwick Airport was purchased in its entirety for £1.5 billion back in 2009. A decade later, just proposing one new runway there was estimated to cost between 10 and 13 billion pounds. And finally, you have the terminals, which are essentially small 24/7 cities, complete with massive underground baggage networks and mind-boggling power requirements. And here is the trap that destroys airport projects more reliably than almost anything else: time. When you borrow billions to build, you start paying interest the exact day the loan clears, not the day the first plane lands. Take the Berlin-Brandenburg Airport. It was scheduled to open in October 2011. It finally opened 9 years late in October 2020. The culprit, a faulty automated fire safety system that triggered endless redesigns. Those 9 years of delays didn't just push the ribbon cutting back. They ballooned the budget from 2 billion euros to a jaw-dropping 7 billion euros. It essentially turned the whole project into a permanent machine that requires government subsidies just to survive. Denver International Airport went through a shockingly similar nightmare in the 1990s. They got delayed by 16 months almost entirely because their brand new $200 million automated baggage handling system just kept mangling and destroying luggage during the testing phase. And that massive number you're seeing, $1.1 million, that was not their yearly expense. That was the daily cost. Every single day, the city of Denver bled $1.1 million in interest and operating expenses, while that sprawling, state-of-the-art airport just sat there, totally empty. Section 2, the revenue squeeze. Now let's talk about the money that finally starts coming in once the planes actually land. So let's say you survive construction. The planes are landing, the money is flowing. But it's not as simple as just charging airlines whatever you feel like. Globally, 63% of airport income is aeronautical revenue. That means the fees charged directly to airlines for things like landing, parking, and passenger departures. And it sounds incredibly lucrative. At Heathrow, for example, airlines pay roughly $9,000 every single time a wide-body aircraft touches down on the tarmac. Sounds like a total gold mine, right? Well, actually, there's a huge hidden trap in that 63% slice of the pie.
The trap is that because airports are absolute textbook monopolies, governments are incredibly strict about capping those fees. Think about it. If you want to fly to London, you essentially have to use Heathrow. Without regulation, Heathrow could basically hold airlines hostage and charge whatever they want. So regulators step in aggressively. Recently, the UK's Civil Aviation Authority capped Heathrow's charge at exactly £21.03 per passenger. That was nearly a 20% reduction from what they were allowed to charge before. The structural reality here is that the answer to how much can I charge the airlines is always going to be less than you want. Section 3, the secret retail empire. This brings us to the twist, the completely unregulated, highly profitable second business. Because that aeronautical revenue is capped by the government, airports have engineered a wildly profitable secondary business right inside the terminal. It's an unregulated empire. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the parking revenue. In the US, parking and ground transportation make up a whopping 46% of all commercial revenue. Because airports own a complete monopoly on all the land surrounding the terminal, they charge an absolute premium. In 2024, Los Angeles International generated about $181 million just from parking. Dallas/Fort Worth, they brought in an astonishing $251 million. And the best part for the airport? Absolutely no regulator is capping those parking fees. And once you step inside the terminal, the retail model is just as ruthless, driven by a brilliant little mechanism called the Minimum Annual Guarantee, or MAG. When a luxury brand or a fast food joint opens up in a terminal, they sign a contract agreeing to pay either a fixed percentage of their gross sales, which is usually around 16 to 20%, or a strict minimum baseline. They pay whichever number is higher. This flawlessly protects the airport. If that duty-free perfume shop has an awful year, it doesn't matter. The airport still gets their guaranteed minimum. But if it's a booming year, the airport gets to ride that wave and take their 20% cut of every single sale. Oh, and the physical architecture itself, it is psychologically weaponized to get you to open your wallet. The second you get through that high-stress security checkpoint, designers funnel you into what they call recomposure zones. These areas have lower ceilings and softer lighting, subconsciously signaling that it's safe to relax and, of course, spend money. Many of those duty-free zones have forced walk-through layouts, which studies show increases sales by up to 60%. And here is a detail I absolutely love. Because most travelers pull their luggage with their right hand, terminal walkways naturally curve to the left. Why? Because it forces your body to continuously look right, directly into the windows of high-margin retail stores. Section 4, the fixed cost trap. Now we need to pivot to the existential threat hanging over every single airport owner. So the commercial revenue is incredible, no doubt. But there's a dark cloud here. The staggering, totally unchangeable fixed costs. Running a 24/7 infrastructure city takes an insane amount of capital. You have multi-mile baggage networks, explosive detection security, emergency services, snow removal, and none of that gets cheaper just because fewer people show up. The lights absolutely must stay on. In April 2020, we all saw what happens when variable revenue crashes into massive fixed costs. 66% of commercial aircraft were grounded worldwide. Industry revenues vaporized by an astonishing $418 billion. But for the airports, those massive bond payments still came due. The utilities still had to be paid. The base cost of running the machine stayed completely intact, even with literally zero passengers in the building. And it's exactly this dynamic that separates the massive failures from the absolute gold mines. Just look at the contrast here. You have catastrophic ghost airports like Spain's Ciudad Real, which cost €1 billion to build, largely driven by local political ambition rather than actual airline data. It went bankrupt in 2 years and was eventually auctioned off for just €56 million. Sri Lanka's Matala Airport faces a very similar fate, sometimes seeing barely a dozen passengers a day while drowning in debt. But then, contrast that with the vital mega-hubs that airlines literally cannot afford to bypass. Take Spain's AENA Group, which manages 46 airports. They printed €5.8 billion in revenue with a €3.5 billion profit. What makes these mega-hubs so incredibly lucrative is their margin. In 2024, that same Iona Group reported an operating profit margin of 60%. Just pause and think about that for a second. In most standard industries, if you had a 10% operating margin, you are popping champagne. That's a very healthy business. An airport operating at a 60% margin is extracting extraordinary, almost unprecedented value from every single person who walks through its sliding glass doors. At their massive volumes, they are generating more cash than almost any comparable physical asset on the planet.
Section 5, the airport of tomorrow. Let's look at where the future of airport economics is heading. So how are the smartest operators evolving to maximize this incredible monopoly even further? Well, the future is rapidly shifting toward what urban planners call the aerotropolis model. Instead of just building a highway to connect an airport to a city, the city is literally being built around the airport. We're talking logistics parks, massive commercial zones, and research facilities constructed concentrically around the terminal. The ultimate goal is to monetize time-sensitive transit, turning the area into its own self-sustaining ecosystem. Airports can lease the surrounding land at absolute premium prices, creating a stable, long-term river of income that is completely detached from daily passenger counts.
And inside the terminal, this push for maximum efficiency is leading to something called invisible security. Because here's the thing. The absolute most expensive part of an airport experience, in terms of lost retail revenue, is the security queue. And this brilliantly illustrates the solution. Biometric face recognition is starting to entirely replace traditional queues. Because every single minute you aren't standing in line taking your shoes off, you are out on the retail floor. No queues, no stopping. You literally just walk right through, maximizing your time to do what they really want you to do. Spend money.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. If you buy an airport, you aren't just buying a standard business. You are buying a piece of critical infrastructure that essentially forces every airline to pay you, every captive traveler to browse your shops, and every driver to pay for your parking lots. But those massive fixed costs are sitting there the day the first plane lands, and they are sitting there the day no planes land at all. The gap between those staggering fixed costs and the final profitability is where vast multi-generational fortunes are either made or lost. So what do you think? Is the ultimate durability of this modern-day toll booth actually worth the multi-billion-dollar gamble? It's definitely a fascinating question to chew on the next time you're forced to walk slightly to the left through a giant duty-free maze. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.